Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 18. Jews, Muslims, Sex, the 4th of July, and the Declaration of Independence. Let's continue the fine comb over the history of the United States, and the American Revolution in particular. Let's leave the memorization of dates and the historical giants, the folklore and myth that comes with them, to your high school history teacher. I'd like to remind you that some of the best and most important history of America isn't found in the textbook, but rather on the roadside signs scattered throughout the countryside. If you pay attention, they tell a tale that is seldom heard outside the small town attractions they advertise. History beckons to be told. Jews in the Revolutionary Era. Jewish people's service during the Revolution is mostly unrecognized, given that it represented only a tiny percent of the overall population. Like other colonial Americans, their loyalties were divided, with a sizable majority favoring an independent America's patriot vision. When revolutionary fervor grew after Britain imposed the demanding Stamp Act in 1765, Jewish merchants' signatures appeared on the various non-importation resolutions adopted by individual colonies. Like other Americans, they opposed the power of the British Parliament to tax the colonies. But some Jews probably had mixed feelings given the freedoms they enjoyed under British rule. Several Jews fought in the Revolution, probably around 100. The first Jew to die fighting in American independence was, ironically, also the first Jew to hold public office in the colonies, Francis Salvador. Mordecai Sheftall of Savannah, Georgia, was the head of the local Revolutionary Committee and was responsible for provisioning soldiers. In 1778, he was appointed Deputy Commissary General for the federal troops, but before Congress could approve, the British captured and imprisoned him and his son in December 1778. Both were taken to a notorious British prison ship, the Nancy, where they were treated poorly. Eventually paroled to a town under British supervision where local Tories beat and killed patriots as British troops evacuated under fire from American forces. Both Sheftalls escaped by sea, only to be recaptured and sent to Antigua. They were freed in 1780 and made their way to Philadelphia to rejoin their family. Reuben Edding of Baltimore enlisted when he heard about the Battle of Lexington and headed north to Massachusetts. He was taken prisoner by the British, who discovered he was Jewish and gave him only pork, which he refused to eat. He was able to survive on scraps permitted food from fellow prisoners. Weakened by such treatment, he died shortly after his release. A cousin bearing the same name, born in 1762, also fought in the war and was appointed as a United States Marshal in 1801 by President Thomas Jefferson. Abigail Minnis supplied provisions to American troops in 1779, angering British authorities. However, she received permission to move with her daughters to safety in Charleston, South Carolina. She died in 1794 at the age of 94. The war inflicted great hardships on individuals and communities alike. Many Jewish merchants suffered dislocations and reverse, and maybe a personal fortune disappeared as merchants found their trade interrupted. Later to gain fame as the mythic Jewish financier of the Revolution, Chaim Salomon began the war as a wealthy merchant whose unstinting financial sacrifices helped keep the revolution going. He died penniless. British attacks forced residents, including Jews, from Newport, Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston. Of the approximately 1,500 Jews scattered among the 13 colonies on the eve of the American Revolution, about 200 lived in Newport, the largest concentration of Jews in the colonies. Aaron Lopez is one of the Newport Jews who opposed British rule and abandoned the city where they had developed roots and prospered. Lopez led his extended family and members of the Rivera and Mendez families, numbering nearly 70 people, to temporary settlement in Leicester, Massachusetts. The renowned synagogue was closed, and its spiritual leader, Isaac Toro, who professed loyalist tendencies, sailed with his family to Jamaica, where he lived out his life under British rule. In New York, as the British fleet appeared in the harbor, Reverend Gershom Mendes Seixas called his congregants to the Mills Street Synagogue. There he delivered a powerful patriotic address, and shortly after that left the city for safety in Stratford, Connecticut. While most other patriotic Jews also left the city, a small number remained behind and, together with their few loyalist Jews, kept the synagogue open. During the war, the congregation was led first by a Tory sympathizer and later by a Jewish Hessian officer who fought with the British and remained after the hostilities ended. Like some other American families, some Jewish families were divided within themselves in the loyalties. David Frank was the king's sole agent in the northern colonies, providing food and supplies to British troops. But other members of the Franks family, David Salisbury Franks and Isaac Franks, served as officers in the Continental Army. For Jews, participation in the war marked the first time since their exile from Jerusalem that they could take their place alongside their Christian neighbors as equals in a fight for freedom. Jews were present at Bunker Hill, Valley Forge, and other battle sites throughout the colonies. Behind the scenes, they provided logistic support by equipping soldiers, shipping supplies, and raising funds. Ship owners such as Isaac Moses of Philadelphia outfitted privateers to harass British shipping. Their ships engaged in running the British blockade to provide necessary provisions to the needy revolutionary forces. Muslims in the American Revolution. The first evidence of Muslims contributing to the Continental Army's success in America's Revolutionary War was a friendship made between George Washington and Sidi Muhammad bin Abdullah, the Morocco Sultan. Sidi Muhammad bin Abdullah offered George Washington the ports of Morocco as a place to dock American ships. This friendly relationship allowed for the Treaty of Marrakesh of 1790 and gave America greater security in England's independence. The friendship also signifies George Washington's attitudes towards Muslims and his potential willingness to welcome them to help fight in his Continental Army and help free the U.S. from Britain. Fighting on American soil, some of the Muslim names that appeared in George Washington's roster included Benjamin Ishmael, Bamfed Muhammad, who fought for the Virginia line, and a man named Peter Buckminster, who changed his name to Peter Salem and became a hero when he was able to kill British Major John Pitcairn at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and then later served as a commander at the battles of Saratoga and the Battle of Stony Point. Also, a man named Salem Poor was initially a slave to a man named John Poor. He purchased his freedom in 1769 for 27 pounds, and shortly after leaving to join the Continental Army. He is best known for his service at Bunker Hill, when he recognized for his bravery at the General Court of Massachusetts in 1775. He was credited with killing British Lieutenant Colonel Abercrombie. U.S. postal stamps feature Salem Poor commemorating his accomplishments. All three of these men were believed to have been slaves who were freed when they agreed to join the Continental Army of George Washington. They were reported to have changed their names to names that represented their Muslim heritage. However, there is no historical evidence besides their name change and the fact that they were freed slaves to prove that these soldiers were in fact Muslims. The most significant evidence of Muslims fighting in the Continental Army lies in the historical records regarding Yusuf ben Ali, or Joseph ben Ali. Ben Ali was reportedly fighting with General Sumter, and his name appears on George Washington's roster of soldiers. Ben Ali was considered a free person of color under the recently passed South Carolina Sundry Act of 1790. His name appears in the census of 1810. His family home is reported in every census. After that, with possibly about 100 families, he settled on Sumter's South Carolina plantation after the Revolution. It was believed Sumter permitted him to have settled this land. Joseph and his brother Scott Ben Ali are reported to be Caucasian men of Arab descent who were initially pirates but later became scouts for General Sumter. The U.S. Journal of Sumter County, South Carolina, also reports that the Benellis to have been Moors, often referred to as Turks because of their association with Muslims and the Ottoman Empire. Sex and the Revolution. The Founding Fathers themselves were some of the most notable proponents of physical intimacy during the Revolution. John Adams was known for telling dirty jokes, and Benjamin Franklin frequented Philadelphia's notorious red light district. Franklin was known for his suave demeanor. It was partly why he was selected to win France's support during the Revolution. But he also used that charm to court women and was very open in discussing romantic relations. One of Franklin's letters outlines advice for finding a mistress. His most significant piece of advice: always go for older women. According to Franklin, their age and wisdom makes them discreet partners. But he was hardly respectful in his aims, stating, quote, "The face first grows lank and wrinkled, then the neck, then the breasts and arms, then the lower parts continue to the last as plump as ever," end quote. Premarital relations were frowned upon in colonial America, but that didn't prevent it from happening. As such, the practice of bundling was created to allow betrothed couples to stay at a girl's house under parental supervision. The young lovers would be placed in a sack similar to a large sleeping bag, with the middle sewn together, preventing any body parts from touching. There were variations on this tradition too. The unmarried couple might be permitted to share a bed to keep warm as long as a board separated them, or they might be watched closely by parents. Naturally, these methods weren't always successful. In the mid to late 1700s, an estimated 1 in 3 brides was pregnant when she said, "I do." In colonial America, physical intimacy was supposed to be reserved for married couples. Luckily, it was easy to get married. All a couple needed to do was clasp hands and declare themselves husband and wife. This quick and easy method was called common law marriage, or hand fasting, and was brought to the colonies by English settlers. Not all these marriages lasted, though. Since they weren't legal documents to certify the union and witnesses weren't required, it was all too easy for a spouse to walk away from the relationship after the marriage had been consummated. While history books tend to avoid the issue, same-sex relationships have existed since the dawn of humankind, and the colonial period was no exception. According to historians, there were such relationships in the Revolutionary America, but many had been documented throughout correspondence. Most institutions forbade intimate relationships between men, but records strongly suggest same-sex partners existed during the war for American independence. While one might picture the past cities as teeming with sex workers, that wasn't the case in colonial America. Widespread religious beliefs discouraged such work, and the demographics of population didn't support large-scale operations. While it still existed, the industry wasn't centralized or well documented in the countryside. However, more employees were working in the trade-insignificant settlements, such as New York and Philadelphia. Thomas Jefferson is celebrated for his liberal ideals, but he kept many slaves throughout his life. One, Sally Hemings, was referred to as his concubine in a 19th century document, although scholars question whether the relationship was consensual. Jefferson probably fathered Hemings 6 children, which caused scandalous rumors during his presidency. His family maintained that the children, who were light-skinned and looked like Jefferson, were fathered by his nephews. After many recent DNA tests, however, it was determined that Jefferson himself was most likely the father of Hemings' children. Toys used for self-pleasure are likely as old as intercourse itself, but there's no record of toys from America's colonial era. Given that many colonists were Puritans, it was expected that toys of this nature weren't discussed or sold publicly. Philadelphia was one of the largest cities in America at the time, and its immense population meant more opportunities for intimate situations. The most famous of the rough neighborhoods in the town was Helltown, rife with poverty, crime, and sex work. Benjamin Franklin himself was rumored to mingle with a few women from this area. Arranged marriages were common in early America. During the 18th century, however, love became more critical consideration for unions. Weddings used to be arranged to consolidate family power, but families' influence over their children declined around the Revolutionary War. The 4th of July. When the initial battles in the Revolutionary War broke out in April 1775, few colonists desired complete independence from Great Britain, and those who did were considered radical. By the middle of the following year, however, many more colonists had come to favor independence, thanks to the growing hostilities against Britain and the spread of revolutionary sentiments such as those expressed in the best-selling pamphlet Common Sense, published by Thomas Paine in earlier 1776. On June 7, when the Continental Congress met at the Pennsylvania State House, later Independence Hall, in Philadelphia, the Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee introduced a motion calling for the colony's independence. Amid heated debate, Congress postponed the vote on Lee's resolution, but appointed a 5-person committee, including Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, John Adams of Massachusetts, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, and Robert R. Livingston of New York, to draft a formal statement justifying the break with Great Britain. On July 2nd, the Continental Congress voted in favor of Lee's resolution for independence in a near-unanimous vote. The New York delegation abstained, but later voted affirmatively. On that day, John Adams wrote his wife Abigail that July 2nd will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival, and that the celebration should include pomp and parade, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other. On July 4th, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Jefferson. Though the vote for actual independence took place on July 2nd, from then on, the 4th became the day that was celebrated as the birth of American freedom. In the pre-revolutionary years, colonists had held annual celebration in the King's birthday, which traditionally included the ringing of bells, bonfires, processions, and speech-making. By contrast, during the summer of 1776, some colonists celebrated the birth of independence by holding mock funerals for King George III as a way of symbolizing the end of the monarchy's hold on America and the triumph of liberty. Festivities, including concerts, bonfires, parades, then the firing of cannons and muskets, usually accompany the Declaration of Independence's first public readings, beginning immediately after its adoption. Philadelphia held the first annual commemoration of independence on July 4, 1777, while Congress was still occupied with the ongoing war. George Washington issued double rations of rum to all his soldiers to mark independence in 1778. In 1781, several months before the key American victory at the Battle of Yorktown, Massachusetts became the first state to ever make the 4th of July an official state holiday. After the Revolutionary War, Americans continued to commemorate Independence Day every year in celebrations that allowed the new nation's emerging political leaders to address citizens and create a feeling of unity. By the last decade of the 18th century, the two major political parties, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republicans, that had begun holding separate 4th of July celebrations in many large cities. The first fireworks were used as early as 200 BCE. The tradition of setting off fireworks on 4th of July began in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1777, during the first organized celebration of Independence Day. Ship's cannons fired a 13-gun salute in honor of the 13 colonies. The Pennsylvania Evening Post reported, quote, "At night, there was a grand expedition of fireworks, which began and concluded with 13 rockets on the Commons, and the city was beautifully illuminated." End quote. That same night, the Sons of Liberty set off fireworks over Boston Commons. The tradition of patriotic celebration began even more widespread after the War of 1812, in which the United States again faced Great Britain. In 1870, the U.S. Congress made July 4th a federal holiday, and in 1941, the provisions were expanded to a grand pay holiday for all federal employees. Over the years, the holiday's political importance would decline, but Independence Day remained an important national holiday and a patriotism symbol. Falling in midsummer, the 4th of July has since the late 19th century become a primary focus of leisure activities and everyday occasions for family get-togethers, often involving fireworks and outdoor barbecues. The most common symbol of the holiday is the American flag, and the common musical accompaniment is the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem of the United States. Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was the first formal statement by a nation's people asserting their right to choose their government. When armed conflict between bands of American colonists and British soldiers began in April 1775, the Americans were ostensibly fighting only for their rights as subjects of the British Crown. By the following summer, with the Revolutionary War in full swing, the movement for independence from Britain had grown, and delegates of the Continental Congress were faced with a vote on the issue. On mid-June 1776, a five-person committee including Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin was tasked with drafting a formal statement of the colony's intentions. The Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence, written mainly by Jefferson, in Philadelphia on July 4th, a date now celebrated as the birth of American independence. Even after the Revolutionary War's initial battles broke out, few colonists desired complete independence from Great Britain, and those who did, like John Adams, were considered radical. However, things changed over the next year as Britain attempted to crush the rebels with all their forces and its great army. In his message to Parliament in October 1775, King George III rallied against the rebellious colonies and ordered the royal army's enlargement and navy. News of his words reached America in January 1776, strengthening the radicals' cause and leading many conservatives to abandon their reconciliation hopes. That same month, the recent British immigrant Thomas Paine published Common Sense, in which he argued that independence was a natural right and only possible course for the colonies, and the pamphlet sold more than 150,000 copies in its first week in publication. In March 1776, North Carolina's Revolutionary Convention became the first to vote in favor of independence. 7 other colonies had followed suit by mid-May. On June 7th, the Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee introduced a motion calling for the colony's independence before the Continental Congress when it met in Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. Amid heated debate, Congress postponed the vote on Lee's resolution and called a recess for several weeks. Before departing, however, delegates appointed a 5-person committee to draft a formal statement justifying the break with Great Britain. That document would be known as the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson had earned a reputation as an eloquent voice for the patriotic cause after his 1774 publication of A Summary View of the Rights of British America. He was given the task of producing a draft of what would become the Declaration of Independence. As he wrote in 1823, the other committee members unanimously pressed on myself alone to undertake the draught. I consented, I drew it, and before I reported to the committee, I communicated it separately to Dr. Franklin and Mr. Adams, requesting their corrections. I then wrote a fair copy, reported it to the committee, and from them, unaltered, to the Congress. As Jefferson drafted it, the Declaration of Independence was divided into 5 sections, including an introduction, a preamble, a body, divided into 2 sections, and a conclusion. In general terms, the introduction effectively stated that British independence had become necessary for the colonies. While the body of the document outlined a list of grievances against the British Crown, the preamble includes its most famous passage. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The Continental Congress reconvened on July 1st, and the following day 12 of the 13 colonies adopted Lee's resolution for independence. The process of consideration and revision of Jefferson's declaration, including Adams' and Franklin's corrections, continued on July 3rd and into the late morning of July 4th, during which Congress deleted and revised some one-fifth of its text. However, the delegates made no changes in the essential preamble, and the essential document remained Jefferson's words. Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence later on the 4th of July, though some historians now accept the document was not signed until August 2nd. The Declaration of Independence became a significant landmark in the history of democracy. In addition to its importance in its fledgling American nation's fate, it also exerted a tremendous influence outside the United States, most memorably in France during the French Revolution. Together with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence can be counted as one of the three essential founding documents of the United States government. Francis Marion. Francis Marion, also known as the Swamp Fox, was a military officer who served in the American Revolution. Acting with the Continental Army and South Carolina militia commissions, he was a persistent adversary of the British in South Carolina and Charleston's occupation in 1780 and 1781, even after the Continental Army was driven out of the state in the Battle of Camden. Marion used irregular methods of warfare and is considered one of the fathers of modern guerrilla warfare. Marion began his military career shortly after his 25th birthday. On January 1, 1757, Francis and his brother Job were recruited by Captain John Postel to serve in the French and Indian War. On June 21, 1775, Marion was commissioned as a captain in the 2nd South Carolina Regiment under William Moultrie, with whom he served in June 1776 in defense of Charleston Harbor. In September 1776, the Continental Congress commissioned Marion as lieutenant colonel. In 1779, he took part in the Siege of Savannah, a failed Franco-American attempt to capture and recover the Georgia colony capital city, which had previously been taken by the British. A British expedition under Henry Clinton moved into South Carolina in the early spring of 1780 and laid siege to Charleston. Marion was not captured with the rest of the garrison when Charleston fell on May 12, 1780, because he had broken an ankle in an incident and had left the city to recuperate. Clinton took part of the British army that had captured Charleston back to New York, but a significant number stayed for operations under Lord Cornwallis in the Carolinas. After the loss in Charleston, the defeats of General Isaac Huger at the Battle of Monk's Corner and Lieutenant Colonel Abram Buford at the Waxhaw Massacre, which is near the North Carolina border in what is now Lancaster County, Marion organized a small unit, which at first consisted of between 20 and 70 men. It was the only force then opposing the British Army in the state. At this point, Marion was still nearly crippled from a slowly healing ankle. Marion joined Major General Horatio Gates on July 27, just before the Battle of Camden, but Gates had formed a low opinion of Marion. Gates sent Marion towards the interior to gather intelligence on the British enemy. Marion thus missed the battle, which proved to be a decisive British victory. Marion showed himself to be a significantly able leader of an irregular militiamen and ruthless to his loyalist terrorizing. Unlike the Continental troops, Marion's men, as they were known, served without pay, supplied their horses, arms, and often their food. Marion rarely committed his men to frontal warfare, but repeatedly bewildered large loyalist or British irregular bodies with quick surprise attacks and equally sudden withdrawal from the field. After Charleston's surrender, the British garrisoned South Carolina with the help of local Tories, except for Williamsburg, which they were never able to hold. The British made one attempt to garrison Williamsburg at the colonial village of Hilltown, but were driven out by Marion at the Battle of Black Mingo. Cornwallis observed, quote, "Colonel Marion was so wrought the mind of his people, partly by the terror of his threats and the cruelty of his punishments, and partly by the promise of plunder, that there were scarcely an inhabitant between the Santee and the PD that was not in arms against us." End quote. The British especially hated Marion and made repeated efforts to neutralize his force. Still, Marion's intelligence gathering was excellent, and that of the British was poor due to the populace's overwhelming patriot loyalty in the Williamsburg area. Colonel Banastre Tarleton was sent to capture or kill Marion in November 1780. He despaired, finding the old swamp fox who eluded him by traveling along swamp paths. It was Tarleton who gave Marion his nom de guerre when, after unsuccessfully pursuing Marion's troop over 26 miles through a swamp, he gave up and swore, "As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him." Once Marion had shown his ability at guerrilla warfare, making himself a serious nuisance to the British, Governor John Rutledge commissioned him a brigadier general of state troops. Marion was also tasked with combating groups of freed slaves working or fighting alongside the British. He received an order from the governor of South Carolina to execute any blacks suspected of carrying provisions or gathering intelligence for the enemy, agreeable to the laws of this state. When Major General Nathanael Greene took command in the South, Marion and Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee were ordered in January 1781 to attack Georgetown, but were unsuccessful. In April, they took Fort Watson, and in May they captured Fort Mott and succeeded in breaking communications between the British posts in the Carolinas. On August 31st, Marion rescued a small American force trapped by 500 British soldiers under the leadership of Major C. Fraser. For this action, he received the thanks of the Continental Congress. Marion commanded the right wing under General Greene at the Battle of Eutaw Springs. In January 1782, he was elected to a newly state assembly at Jacksonboro. He left his troops to take up his seat, and during his absence, his brigade grew disheartened, particularly after a British sortie from Charleston. They were reportedly a conspiracy to take him over to the British, but in June of that year he put down a loyalist uprising on the banks of the Pee River. In August, he left his brigade and returned to his plantation. In 1782, the British Parliament suspended offensive operations in America, and in December 1782, the British withdrew their garrisons from Charleston. The Treaty of Paris ended the war. Marion returned to his plantation to find it had been burnt during the fighting. His slaves had run away to fight for the British and had never been evacuated from Charleston. He borrowed money to purchase slaves for his new plantation. Marion was one of the influences of the main character of Benjamin Martin in the 2000 movie The Patriot, which, according to historians, exaggerated the Swamp Fox legend for a whole new generation. The contrast between the film's depiction of Martin as a family man and hero who single-handedly defeated countless hostile Brits, and the real-life Marion, who was one of the most egregious oversights that Time magazine cited when listing The Patriot as number one of its top 10 historically misleading films in 2011. In the film, Benjamin Martin, played by Mel Gibson, describes the violence he committed in the French Indian War. Around the time of the film's release, comments in the British press challenged the American notion of Marion as a hero. In the Evening Standard, British author Neil Norman called him a, quote, thoroughly unpleasant dude who was basically a terrorist. Concurrently, the British historian Christopher Hibbert described Marion as, quote, very active in the persecution of the Cherokee Indians, and not at all the sort of chap who would be celebrated as a hero. The truth is that people like Marion committed atrocities as bad, if not worse, than those perpetrated by the British. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM Podcast.